Okay, everybody, make sure you have your notes out. We're going to take a look at two things today: the triumph of industry, as well as the rise of big business. From this first part, what we want you to get out of it is to better understand how exactly did industrialization and new technology affect the economy and society. We know that after the Civil War, factories were stepping up production, especially in the North, finding new ways to produce things such as guns, ammo, uniforms in large numbers. Railroads were expanding, and more efficient uses of creating power were developing. As this was all happening, the government was encouraging immigration to meet greater demands in factories. So as we take a look at this first map here, we're not taking a look at the states, territories, non-organized territories, but I want you to take a look at where the mouse is going at some of the areas. All up and along the eastern seaboard here is a very important area where coal mines were being worked by primarily by children and immigrants. And essentially what they're trying to get from this was the coal power that could power steam locomotives and factories. Throughout much of the nation, especially going out west, thick forests across the country were cut into lumber for construction. Closer to the greater Midwest, especially the Erie Canal, there were navigable riverways that transported these resources as well as others into cities, especially within the factories that were there. Most importantly, though, was within Pennsylvania, in the town of Titusville, Pennsylvania. Edwin Drake was the first to discover and drill oil within the United States, obviously becoming a major industry later to be used for fuel. The question now becomes is who's going to do all of this work that would be done in the factories? If we look at this graphic here, we see that there's quite a bit of growth over the course of about 180 years, where we see more immigrants coming to the United States. If we take a look in 1880, we see a much larger amount of immigrants coming to the country at that time. In fact, in 1881, 750,000 immigrants arrived, both from Asia and Europe. Most people were coming due to push factors, as we talked about in the past, due to political upheaval, religious discrimination, and crop failure. While there would be a slight dip, by about 1905, we're starting to see a steady rise of over 1 million immigrants coming to the United States per year from either coast. Immigrants frequently were prepared to move in pursuit of economic opportunity, and the big result was that they were a huge, willing workforce, willing to work for next to nothing and do anything that was asked of them. Now, why did they come? Well, if you take a look at this book cover here, the book itself is known as Ragged Dick, or The Life in New York, and its author, Horatio Alger, told the story of a poor boy who rose from wealth and fame by working hard. So in other words, it's the emphasis on work ethic, it's the American dream, the rags to riches story. And this is the idea that many of the immigrants clung to. This idea was dependent on the system of capitalism, where people have the opportunity to privately own their own businesses. The heroes, especially in the story, were known as entrepreneurs, people who invest money in a product to make a profit. And what it made it possible were some of the causes of rapid industrialization. So we've talked about the abundant resources, we've talked about the skilled and unskilled labor forces. We're taking a look at the entrepreneurs who eventually, many of which would become known as the robber barons, that we'll get to in a little bit. But a lot of this was dependent upon the government as well. And what this was known as was a laissez-faire policy, the government's policy of allowing businesses to operate under minimal government regulation. In addition to this was innovation driving the nation. We've talked about patents before. We define them as the exclusive right of an inventor to develop, use, and sell an innovation. And this could come in a wide variety of things, but some of the most important and influential inventions during this time period that we're taking a look at include some of the following. We've talked about Thomas Edison, and we're all very familiar of his invention of the light bulb, known as the Wizard of Menlo Park. He was more than just the creator of the light bulb. Financed by businessmen to create these new innovations, he's also responsible for the phonograph, the dictaphone, which is kind of what I'm talking into now, which is a microphone, but this is a much more primitive version. Alexander Graham Bell created the telephone. A little bit different than what we're used to carrying around in our pockets today. It doesn't sound like much, but by 1900 there's more than 1 million phones within the United States. This last invention, probably not the most popular, but definitely influential, is known as the Bessemer process. By 1890, Americans were outproducing British steel manufacturers. A method of producing lightweight but strong steel was known as the Bessemer process. Strong steel made possible quite a bit of things, such as creating skyscrapers and elevators. Probably one of the most dramatic uses of the Bessemer process was the construction of suspension bridges, such as the Brooklyn Bridge that we see here. Spanned the East River in New York City, though not complete in this image. It was complete in 1883, and at the time it was the longest bridge in the world. The impact of such industrialization and innovation was that it would definitely touch, as it says, every aspect of American life. It caused America to become more urban, less agricultural, but even in that sense, many farms became mechanized. Some farmers were forced out of work, in which case many moved their families to urban areas to find work, usually in the industrial north to work in growing factories or industries. In this image here, this isn't a typical city, but this is the World's Fair or the Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, known as the White City. What a more typical image would look like would be something like this, where we're looking at Mulberry Street, New York City, which we see neighborhoods that were full of immigrants trying to assimilate to America and get good jobs, but at the same point in time bringing a lot of those practices and traditions with them. At the same point in time, very few people were worried about how industry might affect the environment. So industrial waste had risen dramatically, mining had begun to destroy the land. As we take a look at this image here of Whiting, Indiana, where a Standard Oil plant is obviously creating quite a bit of pollution, wasn't a little concerned about that. Towards the latter half of the 1800s, people did begin to raise some concerns about protecting natural resources, and Congress responded by creating the National Park Service. The first national park it developed was Yellowstone National Park in 1872, and it was one of the first federal responses to the concern about the environment. The second concept that we're going to take a look at is the rise of big business. So these are the entrepreneurs that eventually would create monopolies or large corporations. What we want you to understand by the end of this is how did big businesses shape the American economy in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. So early on, probably up until about the mid-1850s, most businesses were family run, usually local, and they bought and sold to customers who lived nearby. Industrialization was changing all of this. Railroads were providing businesses with access to raw materials from far away, and businesses could access customers that were living farther away. To take advantage of these markets that were farther away and increase businesses, investors usually developed corporations. So we see some of the modern corporations, Google, AT&T, Microsoft are just a few among many. But as you see in the definition, a corporation is when a number of people share ownership of a business. In fact, when you own part of a corporation, it is known as a share. Investors lose no more than they had originally invested in the company if it does poorly, but they also stand to make a profit if the company does well. Corporations typically have the same rights as people. They could buy or sell property, and they could also could actually sue in court. If a person leaves the corporation, another person could buy up their shares or their interest in the company. It was by railroads and communication lines that corporations had the ability to operate in several different regions. Corporations could usually maximize their profits in a couple of ways. They could decrease the production of goods by paying workers low wages, which immigrants would typically be paid, and would result in the development of unions and eventually strikes. They could pay as little as possible for raw materials, seeking out the cheapest that they could find, or they can increase profits through advertising. Others try to go a less, I guess we could say, honest way in that they would create monopolies. They would try to get complete control of a product or a service industry. In order to do it, a corporation either bought out its competitors or they drove them out of business. Once consumers had nowhere else to go for a product, the only remaining company could then set the prices. A good example of this would be corporations run by John D. Rockefeller, who was the Standard Oil tycoon, often known as the wealthiest man in American history. He made deals with railroad companies to increase his profits. He did this by paying off the railroad companies to refuse transportation to his competitors. Another way of increasing profits and decreasing costs is consolidating. What Rockefeller would do would buy up rival businesses to gain more control over the oil refining industry. What this is known as is horizontal integration. So as you see on this chart here, he would essentially control all of the oil companies within the United States at the time, or the majority, so that the small ones could not compete with him. Certain state laws prevented one company from owning stock in another, meaning that Rockefeller could not buy out his competition. So his lawyer had an idea of how to get around it in creating something known as a trust. So in a trust, companies assign stocks to a board of trustees who combine them into a new organization. This is like holding majority of interest in a variety of companies. Andrew Carnegie was a different type of industrialist. He was the founder of the U.S. Steel Company, and he increased power by gaining control of many different businesses that make up all phases of a company's production. So whereas horizontal integration dominates an industry, vertical integration controls all parts that are important to, in his case, U.S. Steel, from something such as transportation to development, marketing, everything in between. Now the question becomes is, how do we view these guys? Well, there was a British economist by the name of Herbert Spencer, a professor at Yale, who said that not long after Charles Darwin had written his book, The Origin of the Species, where he argues that animals evolved by natural selection, the same thing happens in society. He would use the policy of laissez-faire to explain this. He believed that the U.S. would grow strong by allowing its most vigorous members to rise to the top, and that this theory also led to the supporters to go against the use of government funds to help the poor, stating that the poverty-stricken conditions of many minority groups is evidence as being unfit. Now, here's the next question. Well, let's take a look at this first. If we're comparing this to Darwin, the corporations would be the lions, and obviously the small business that would be bought out or put out of business would be whatever animal that is being destroyed. Do we view these guys as robber barons or captain of industries? Some people thought that consumers were harmed by unfair prices that monopolies set on these products, hence the term robber baron. Others deemed these guys captains of industry in the fact that railroads and steel mills provided jobs for an ever-growing workforce. They also felt that these individuals were innovators and they developed technology that benefit the nation's economy. So who are we talking about? Guys such as J.P. Morgan, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, and Gould, all various industrialists. We got to take a look at them in a different way. Let's examine this. Some people view them, like I said, as captains of industry. Many of these guys gave quite a bit to charity, but Carnegie was probably perhaps the most to state this publicly, in which he said that the rich have a moral obligation to give away their fortunes. In his book, The Gospel of Wealth, he asserted that all personal wealth beyond that requires the needs of one's family should be given to the benefit of the community, otherwise known as philanthropy. Carnegie gave many of his money to develop libraries. There's over 2,000 within the United States. Other guys, such as Rockefeller, invented a conditional grant, which he required all recipients to apply for money in a given year, much money going to medical causes. Vanderbilt would obviously donate money to Vanderbilt University. Eventually, the Sherman Antitrust Act was created, which outlawed any trust that operated in restraint of trade or commerce among several states. Ultimately, the act began a trend toward federal limitations on corporate power.